Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Leticia Gomez Franco, and I am the Executive Director of the Balboa Art Conservation Center. The Balboa Art Conservation Center is a cultural preservation and art conservation nonprofit organization. We are located in Balboa Park here in San Diego. We are one of very few, maybe about 9 or 10 nonprofit regional labs in the country, and we are the only one located in the Western region. Basically, what this means is that we have as our mandate to support collecting institutions that have art collections, historical collections, cultural material, and the conservation and preservation of their materials, and also to be the kind of lead organization in helping to demystify what art conservation is as a practice and a field in our communities. We are very committed to shifting into an organization that is truly and radically inclusive. This program is a very first tiny step in that direction, and really kind of getting to know our communities, our San Diego communities, our regional communities, and finding out together what art conservation looks like in different communities, different neighborhoods, and different cultures. So welcome and thank you for joining us today. I will be your moderator for today's conversation. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that I am joining you from the ancestral homelands of the Kumeyaay Nation. Kumeyaay peoples continue to maintain their connection to and care for this land. Welcome to the first of 4 sessions for Preserving Chicana, Chicano, Chicanx Art Conversations on Conservation. This program is a collaborative effort between the Balboa Art Conservation Center, the Centro Cultural de la Raza, and the many wonderful participants who have graciously agreed to join us throughout the month of April to open a dialogue on what art conservation and cultural preservation looks like for the Chicano community. This program is funded by the California Humanities and the City of San Diego Commission for Arts and Culture. Before we begin, I would like to invite everyone to use the chat space to share all of your ideas and your curiosities. Our goal for these conversations is not necessarily to define answers, but rather to instigate more questions. We are in investigation mode and a meeting here today in an informal way to dialogue about some curiosities. Please share any additional questions or topics that come up as these conversations progress, and we will be compiling these into a kind of cabinet of curiosities / Google Doc, and using these as a guide to inform what additional conversations, conferences, gatherings need to happen to move the conversation forward. Needless to say, this is only the beginning. I want to do a special shout out to the folks at the Centro. And while I do mean the folks who make the Centro successful, I also mean quite literally the folks who are at the Centro at this moment. Roberto Hernandez, who is the chair of the Centro's board and professor of Chicano studies at San Diego State University, has invited his Chicano studies students to join us in a collective viewing of this panel from the Centro itself. So props to you, and we hope that you send us all your questions and comments, put them in the chat. If we don't get the time to address those questions today, we will be compiling them. Even if we say a word or there's a term or a concept that you'd like to be explored further, just drop it in there. And this really will be kind of a guiding document to think about all the things that we could possibly be thinking about. And we know that that list is limitless, and we're excited to delve into it. And we will be making that document accessible, so everyone has access to the curiosities. And also please note that these sessions are being recorded and also will be shared. Today's topic is Con Safos as self-preservation. What does art conservation and cultural preservation look like for the Chicana, Chicano, Chicanx community? And joining us is Maria Figueroa, professor of English Literature and Humanities at Miracosta College. Her pronouns are she, her, ella. Victor Ochoa, artist and activist. His pronouns are he, him, his. And Bianca Garcia, associate conservator of paintings at the Balboa Art Conservation Center, and her pronouns are she, her, hers. I am going to further introduce our participants by reading their bios, because I think it's important for us to acknowledge all of the amazing work that these folks have been doing in our communities and beyond. And then once I'm done with that, we'll kick off with the first question. And this really is kind of meant to be an interactive dialogue where we all kind of get to share ideas and concepts and dig deeper into some of these concepts and ideas. So first off, Maria Figueroa is a maestra, mamá, teatrista, poeta, hija, hermana, and traditional Aztec dancer. Originally from Santana, California, where her roots run 3 generations deep, Maria attended UC San Diego, where she received her BA in theater with minors in ethnic studies and Spanish literature, and went on to complete her MA in comparative lit from Dartmouth College in New Hampshire. Maria's work has been published in various anthologies, including Velvet Barrios, Popular Culture, and Chicana, Chicano Sexualities, edited by Alicia Gaspar de Alba, Fleshing the Spirit, Spirituality and Activism in Chicana, Latina, and Indigenous Women's Lives, edited by Elisa Facho and Irene Lara, Voices from the Ancestors, Chicanx and Latinx Spiritual Expressions and Healing Practices, and most recently in Search of Our Brown Selves, a transdisciplinary reader designed with Chicanic students in mind. She makes her professional home as a professor of English composition, literature, and humanities at Maricosa College in Oceanside, California, where she has also served as an English professor for the Puente program, a program to which she has dedicated 16 years of her professional career. In 2018, Maria was recognized by the Latino Book and Family Festival with the Excelencia de Maestro Award and recognized as Woman of the Year Award by Assemblywoman Tasha Berner Horvath in the same year. I apologize if I read that wrong. Her community work spans over 25 years, predominantly in the area of cultural preservation and traditional arts. She is a co-lead of Danza Cuatlicue, a traditional Aztec dance group committed to preserving the dance and spiritual traditions of the Mexican indigenous diaspora. In her role as community advisory chair and board member of the Centro Cultural de la Raza, she ensures the voice and perspectives of the local community is represented. Maria recently chaired the Centro Cultural de la Raza's 50th virtual gala kickoff, honoring the 50th anniversary of the founding of the historical Centro Cultural de la Raza in Balboa Park. Along with her precious masterpieces, Cuauhtémoc and Esperanza Tonantzin, and her loving partner, she makes her home in the Kumeyaay coastal lands of North County of San Diego, where she also enjoys long spiritual runs.
Gracias, Leticia. Gracias.
Next up is Victor Ochoa, artist and activist. Victor Ochoa is an artist and activist that has worked in many communities throughout the world. Based in the border zone of Tijuana and San Diego, his work stems from the human rights issues of the 60s that still remain his topics. His process has developed from that community democratic dynamics that he learned from countless community-based murals. He is the co-founder of the Centro Cultural de la Raza, serving in the organization as director, artist in resident, and binational liaison between San Diego and border cultural organizations from all states along the border in both countries. Member of the Border Arts Workshop, Taller de Arte Fronterizo, as well as the Chicano Park Steering Committee since 1970. He has been responsible for coordinating murals in Chicano Park and restorations, as well as currently working on the Anastasia Hernandez Rojas mural about immigration and the current situation at the border. Has been working with the archives of UCSB for over 30 years, contributing his documentation, slides, and video leading up to currently in an advisory capacity with the, with the Chicano Park Museum and Cultural Center. His work includes arts exhibitions, museum displays, and art installations. Currently has one of the San Diego History Center in Balboa Park with a 39-foot long by 9-foot high wall installation of a large-scale photo montage. Throughout his experience as a muralist, he has worked in the development of El Taller de Gráfica workshop that has involved him with various levels of education, including elementary, high school, to university classroom instructor. Victor has been involved in Chicano murals and graphics, as well as various types of public art and sculpture, including graffiti since 1983, developing the first permission walls projects, Writer's Block, and Battlegrounds, to public art collaborations, including the creation of new urban public art, a mixture of many styles of muralism, including the new graffiti. Victor Ochoa wrote the Chicano Park Restoration Manual to be used to restore the park and guide future artists about maintenance and restoration. And finally, we have Bianca Garcia, Associate Conservator of Paintings at the Balboa Art Conservation Center. Bianca is an associate conservator of paintings at BACC. She earned her master's in science in art conservation from the Winterthur University of Delaware program in art conservation in 2016 with a concentration in paintings conservation, and she received her BA in art conservation with a minor in art history from the University of Delaware in 2007. Bianca came to San Diego and BACC in 2016 as a Mellon Fellow in Paintings Conservation and was permanently hired as Assistant Conservator of Paintings the following year. Prior to her time at BACC, Bianca completed internships at the Cleveland Museum of Art in Cleveland, Ohio, the Museo Nacional Centro de Arte Reina Sofía in Madrid, Spain, Western Center for the Conservation of Fine Arts in Denver, Colorado, the Museum of Art in Puerto Rico and San Juan, Puerto Rico, the New Orleans Conservation Guild in New Orleans, and the National Center for Preservation Technology and Training. I'm going to say that wrong. Natchitoches? Sorry.
It's pronounced Natchitoches.
I would not have guessed that. Thank you. She loves working in a dynamic environment that BACC provides, from treatment to collections care to program development. Most of her everyday work entails the examination, condition assessment, and treatment of paintings and painted objects, such as polychrome sculptures. She also carries out technical examinations of artworks, including examining paintings with infrared reflectography, X-radiography, and X-ray fluorescence spectroscopy, and also assists in the teaching of workshops and lecture presentations to support collections care and other institutions. While Bianca considers herself a generalist and enjoys treating the wide range of paintings that come into BACC every day, she is particularly interested in the pre-20th century paintings, Vice-Regal and Latin American art, and polychrome sculptures. Outside of paintings conservation, Bianca is interested in increasing access to preservation services, education, and knowledge, and mentoring students and emerging conservation professionals. As a Latina born and raised in Puerto Rico, she is also invested in diversifying and increasing equity and representation in the field of art conservation and the communities we serve, and exploring culturally inclusive preservation practices. In addition to her work as a paintings conservator at BACC, she also serves as the program manager for the Andrew W. Mellon Opportunity for Diversity and Conservation, an initiative of the UCLA Getty program in the conservation of cultural heritage that supports funded opportunities for students interested in conservation who are from backgrounds that are historically underrepresented in this field. Bianca is also a founding member of Materia, Journal of Technical History, and open access peer-reviewed digital journal specializing in the material study of cultural heritage. Okay, that was a bios. Thank you very much for that. We'll now move on to our first topic of conversation, which is con Safos. We'll be exploring the history, meaning, and significance of con Safos. Con Safos as Chicana, Chicano, Chicanic spirituality and healing, and con Safos as conservation and preservation. So we'll start off by inviting Maria. Maria, can you tell us a little bit about con Safos, its history, and its cultural significance?
Thank you so much for the lovely introductions, and I'm so honored to be here with everyone. So gracias for the opportunity to engage in this conversación, in this plática. And I have to say that I was talking with my compañero, who's also a professor of Chicana and Chicano studies, Chicanx studies, and we're like, okay, so who defined con Safos? And you know, as people who do research and who perhaps over intellectualize some things, we're thinking, you know, is there a definition? And I think that we can argue that the definition comes from the people and it comes from the representation of a placazo or of a sign-off. And so I would say that it's defined as a modo de ser, as an existence, emphasizing one's identity or an identity of making it public. And es como tu marca, or as my dad would say, punto y final. And so I think there is a finality that perhaps to it, which I think speaks to marking an existence, to marking it, again, publicly, such as, you know, symbolically, such as on an art wall, you could say graffiti. When society makes it a point to invisibilize communities that assert this particular a symbol of con Safos. And in this way, I think our presence remains indefinite. It remains, you know, kind of marked forever and indefinitely a nuestro modo, on our terms. And I would say that I grew up understanding more orally, you know, what CS or con Safos meant among my younger father and my younger tios. And I wouldn't say that I ever threw up a con Safos anywhere, maybe just in a notebook privately, you know, in my wishful thinking that I had that agency as a young woman. But really, I think it came full circle for me when I engaged with Burciaga's work, you know, and Burciaga as sort of the father of Chicano story and kind of everyday realities, and making our realities kind of come to life and make sense. You know, he sort of describes con Safos in History and Cultura as which is a very important, I think, book for all of us to engage with as kind of, again, that sign off. And so that would be my offering today in beginning the conversation around con Safos.
That was beautiful. Thank you for that. Victor, can you tell us a little bit about how con Safos has played a role in your artwork or in your experience?
Well, I first encountered it in like Maria was saying, placas, you know, where either you said Barrio Logan or whatever barrio you're from, and you would see that. And I was told that it meant like a saying that we used to say when I was a kid, botellita de Jerez, todo lo que digas será al revés. So it was kind of like a warning for any other barrio, don't mess with it, you know, and it was kind of a little threatening too. And I think it had, to me, kind of a little brujeria part to it that I always liked, because it don't, you know, even though it might be subliminal, we have some spiritual powers that we can, you know, I don't have to go call a bunch of homeboys and go after you. That spirituality would be part of it. I know my dad was a pachuco in the 40s, and he used it in even tattoos. You know, he didn't have it tattooed on himself, but other of his friends also used it. And I was pretty rebellious. I think that the use of Spanish, you know, in a lot of my murals, you see like Barrio Si, Yonques No, I changed the letter of Barrio to a V, not because my name is Victor, it was kind of a revolutionary response to even Spanish being a European language. And in our search to learning Nahuatl and other indigenous languages. And so when I put it on paper or posters or murals, I changed it up to KZ. And I think we did that, you know, to kind of like bring attention to it, and people would ask. And I think afterwards, a lot of us changed the letters, and people understood what it meant. You know, I know that I really loved in later years that I noticed that the young people were saying respeto every time they saw con Safos, they would immediately repeat respeto. So it kind of shocked me when I first heard it like that, but I really liked it. I really liked the fact that people felt respectful. And I think that that's one of the things that we do in doing cultural work, is that we want to bring respect to our heritage, to our history, to our families, to ourselves as individuals. So I really, that was one of the last definitions that I think I really enjoyed.
That was great. Thank you for sharing that. I want to share a little bit about a recent experience actually that we had with Safos, which was what inspired us to kind of kick off this conversation with that term. We were in the labs at BACC, and a piece came in. Actually, it was a piece by Mario Torero that has the Batman piece. I think the Batman Un Cholo is called. And that piece has the letters CS con Safos in it. So we were in the labs and we were talking about the visual images of the piece, and I brought up the term con Safos. And the conservators in the lab were not familiar with the term. So I started to talk about it, and I just, kind of following Burciaga's terms there, talked about it as a marker, literally meaning with safety, but kind of a protective shield that could be used. It was used in graffiti and in tags, but then also kind of expanded its borders to be used in written materials, right, in poems and in artwork and so many different kinds of aesthetics. So that the con Safos on this art piece, right, protects it from being tampered with. And then we started to have this conversation about who the piece was being protected from. And part of the really kind of deep internal work that we have been doing at BACC over the past couple of years has really been to consider what our role as a conservation center, as a historically white-led, serving conservation center that is very much institutionalized, what role we have had in kind of the erasure of communities that are not being served. And there's a movement within the field to kind of acknowledge that, right? That you can't kind of wash your hands off of the responsibility that we have of being inclusive, because we're kind of behind the scenes part of the art world, but rather every decision that we make affects how inside or outside we are, and how inside or outside we cast others to be. So this kind of atonement that we're going through right now as an organization, and acknowledging this role that we have played, comes with the acknowledgement of kind of the otherizing of our own selves, right? So when we are talking about who is con Safos protecting this piece from, and we acknowledge that we as an institution have played a role in erasure, then we can conclude that perhaps these pieces are also protecting the piece from institutions like ourselves, right? So the Chicano work is layered with a spiritual protective shield, so that the work doesn't become whitewashed, or that it doesn't lose its connection to community and its authenticity. And it made for a really, really deep conversation within ourselves, our staff, but then we were lucky enough to be able to be in conversation with Mario Torero, where he also talked about what con Safos meant to him and what it meant in his piece, and also in this conversation gave us permission to treat the piece, right? So this idea that that treatment and conservation could be invasive, and what kind of permissions are needed in able to move forward with such a technical thing like art conservation. We thought it would be a perfect kind of introduction into these sessions, because the term con Safos kind of really intersects this very deep kind of ancient spirituality within the Chicanx community, and this very technical process of art conservation, and kind of brings together a space of conservation as healing, right? Conservators are healers of cultural material. What permissions and what authorizations need to happen, and what familiarity and knowledge needs to be shared, so that when that treatment happens, it happens from the right place. So those conversations amongst us are really kind of what instigated this larger curiosity of wanting to hear from the community what this looks like and what this means for the community. So we thought this would be great. And Maria and Victor, both of your contributions really kind of help to shape that for us, and to be able, so that we can take that away and really understand the multiplicity of the term. So now we can, I'll move on to Bianca and ask Bianca, as an art conservator, can you share with us how the work of conservation supports this concept of healing and protection and safety?
Yeah, I think you've already kind of touched a little bit on some of the things that I was gonna also discuss, but it's part of these greater conversations that we've been having over the past year. So as conservators, we're trained to care for art, care for cultural heritage, and act as healers and protect them. And we are looking for the safety of them. But sometimes I think it's important to also keep in mind that our perspective, our understanding of processes and materials and techniques is not the be all end all, and that there are other perspectives and approaches to caring for cultural collections and ancestors. And it's important to be mindful that we're not gatekeepers, that we don't have total control of what the conversation is gonna sound like and be like, and who has access to our services, who has access to having a say or a voice in this conversation of what is important, what is valuable, what are we trying to preserve here. So conservation, when it's done in conversation with community, with the caretakers, can be an act of healing for both parties involved and for the culture that we are caring for. Through these objects and the materiality of it, we are preserving so much of this intangible cultural knowledge. And so we're working towards the same goal, and we should always be in conversation with community in order for it to actually be a space of healing, of protection, and of safety. And I think it is our common goal for that to happen. So I think just reiterating some of that, through the act of extending, whether the intent is to extend the lifespan of a material object or not, because sometimes it's also not appropriate, and we need to also keep that in mind. But I think we lose sight of some of those things when we don't engage in these kinds of open conversations with the source communities, and we take guidance from them rather than us imposing maybe some of these, I don't want to say misguided standards, because they're very appropriate for certain types of cultural materials, but you cannot just apply them to everything. And that's how it's been traditionally done. So taking a step back, listening, understanding what really is appropriate is what will get us there.
Thank you for that, Bianca. So now we've had an opportunity to think about Safos from a Chicana Chicanx historical cultural perspective, as healing and as protection and safety, first and foremost. And then we've also had an opportunity to listen to Bianca tell us a little bit about kind of the technical approach to work and the different kind of conocimientos that the work can benefit from when it happens. I love how beautifully you say that conservation work can be healing when it happens in conjunction with community. And I think that's a really beautiful way to frame it. So now that we've heard kind of both of those sides, Maria, I would love to invite you to give us some thoughts on how the Chicano Chicanx community can conceptualize and contextualize art conservation as part of its cultural process.
So this question, I think, is a really interesting one, because you also used, like in the preparation, you used spiritual as a summoning of protection. And to me, that is a very powerful calling. It's like, it's Victor says como una brujería, and I don't mean to like trivialize that in any way, because that can be very real for some people. But for me, it's a calling, and it's like an intensity. And when I think about art being arte es vida, it's like our direct, when we produce, or when we embody art, when we produce and engage with it, I think we're in the most profound and direct connection to creator, or to a creative energy. And I remember in the early 2000s, I was part of a consortium of teatristas who revisited the original, teatros of Aztlán, of Tenaz. And so we tried to recreate this encuentro at UCLA. And it was, many people in the UC system. It was at UCLA for, I think, a couple of days, a weekend. And I co-directed a piece with Dr. Jorge Huerta, who's emeritus at UCSD. And we had, en paz descanse, Maestro Jose Montoya be one of the speakers and the openers. And his prayer in that opening he made us all stand up, and he says, all of you are creator, because you're all here to be creative and participate in this endeavor. And that has stayed with me, for a very long time. And so this summoning of being one with the art and with the elemental forces, like that to me is part of that protection that we summon when we are engaging in this either public or private as a conservator process, or in a more public and communal context of revitalization, which I know we'll get to eventually. And what I've learned in my circles of what we call the Red Road or the Beauty Way, in kind of reclaiming our indigeneity as a component of our spiritual processes, that we are in relation to everyone, like all my relations, or the notion of tlokenawake, of ometeot. And so I think all of these, if you want to call them like indigenous knowledges or philosophies, are part of how we invoke, if you will, or summon con Safos as a protective entity, or as a protective energy to do the work that we need to do to tell our stories in whichever modality or genre of art that we produce and that we put out into the world, or through words, or through music, or danza, and that we do so in a way that is in harmony with elemental, components of this world and of this earth, and in our community, and that we do so in harmony with our communities. Again, embracing, I think, the cultural philosophies and knowledge systems of our communities, so that we're not divorced from them, and we're not doing something else that our community doesn't necessarily support or want. And I would take it even a step further, that was not intended to, based on our ancestral lineages and sort of future, ancestral thinking. So I think that it's, I loved that question. I was like, ooh, I can talk more about it. So I'm sure that we will return to it, because I have more to say, but I'd like to just kind of ground that right now here.
I love that. That was beautiful. There is so much to intersect there. And I love this thought that you shared about all of us kind of being creators when we're being creative, and this kind of production that is ongoing. And I think that's a perfect segue to our next topic, which is this really interesting idea of conservation versus revitalization. And it's interesting because it kind of pits it against one or the other in a really interesting way. And we can start off by talking a little bit about Chicano Park and the murals. I first read about this idea of conservation versus revitalization in an article written by Gail Perez that I will share in the chat so everyone else can take a look at it. But it's addressing the conservation, or rather the conservation and revitalization of the Chicano Park murals. So in order to set us up for that, we'll go to Victor so that you can share with us a little bit of the history and the context of the murals. And you've been very involved in all the phases of it. So I'd love to hear some insights from you. So you have played a major role in Chicano Park and its collection of murals. Can you share with us a little bit about the park, the history, and the story of the murals?
Well, it's been like 50 years, so it's had just about all the kinds of interactions with different students, with different groups. And, you know, you're talking about, I have to say that I entered into muralism and Chicanismo through my grandfather that was archivist. And when I told him finally, he was teaching me how to do folders, manila folders, and that. When I told him I was a Chicano, he said, finally, he had 50 grandkids. I'm the oldest. And he said, somebody, you know, salió finalmente, somebody that's preoccupied of their history and the issues that affect us. Because he was in the United States in the 30s, and he used to call the US people Yankees still. And so, and he says, when you're over there, you got to realize that they don't care about any of our history or our language or anything. It's your job to preserve this material. And right away, I thought, well, you know, in painting murals, there's something about open library to the community, but then it's open to the weather, to the carbon monoxide, the salts of the bay, and all this. So it has a really heavy duty chemical reaction to the atmosphere. And so I've been kind of a stickler on materials and durability of different kinds of bases of paints and that. And I know that we were broke in the 70s, so we try to use the best materials possible. And it was my job, along with Guillermo Aranda and others, to find out that material. But we found out that we couldn't afford the material that really lasted a long time. So I remember the first materials were vinyl. And so I know that during the restoration campaign that we had at the park, I think it was like 12 years ago, where we wrote the book on the materials and suggestions on how to restore them. That question of, is it revitalizing them? Is it, you know, we had all these different questions. I think first of all, we tried to get the original artists involved in restoring their murals so that there wouldn't be too many problems with the original painting. And this is like after 30 years of painting murals, many artists said, well, I've definitely improved my style and my techniques since I was a kid. Since I was 20, now I'm 40 or 50. And so, you know, I need the opportunity to improve my mural from the original one that I painted. But then right away, we asked, what do you want to change? Because we were pretty sticklers in the steering committee that we didn't want to change the initial issues or the theme or concepts of those murals. So we tried to make sure that everybody kept with the original concept. And I know that as we were going on, I think we really improved our techniques. And I think we did everything with respect. So it was really great to see the new products, the new murals. And a lot of us, I know when I first went to Cuba, they were doing a lot of restorations and buildings and they would leave a window in the wall where they wouldn't touch that window. Not a window per se, but an area of the wall. And you could tell that how that building was built, if it was stone or concrete or mud or rocks and I try to do that in several murals where I would leave the original paint that I used 30 years before, and I would cover that with a special clear, protected clear, and then restore all around it. So that there was still access to the original paint that we used in the original painting. And I just have to keep on mentioning archives, because I think murals act like archives. And when you see 52 years of history on a project, you see that I started saving everything that we were doing at the Centro, at the park, and start filing them in filing cabinets. And the first initial bunch of material that I gave the University of Santa Barbara Multicultural Archives was 45 legal size drawers, filing cabinet drawers. And it was like, oh my God, where are we gonna? I kind of wanted to get rid of it because we really didn't have that much space at the Centro. And I kept on putting things in folders and filing them. So I still feel that it's so important to document. Like every time students go to the park, I'll stop and talk to them to make sure that they have the right information and where to get the correct information. And it's always, this whole time it's been like that. I had a Frontera newspaper yesterday, and it was like it was the 1970s, the same questions of what is being a Chicano, what issues do you still work on? And it's I'm not sure if I went off on a tangent, but I know that archiving to me and the preservation of the original work is utmost importance. I just want to mention briefly that I made a note here that danza, when we first came in with a lot of different of the capitanes original that came to San Diego, I realized that danza as a discipline really taught us a lot of our history in the concepts from pre-Columbian times to contemporary times. And I really loved the fact that we were practicing something that was teaching us something that came from hundreds of thousands of years ago through that discipline. So I've always had the utmost respect to the ceremony and the act of danza in the discipline. And that's one of the benefits of working at the Centro, where, you know, I was simply somebody that liked to draw, but being at the Centro, we had poets and dancers, musicians, actors. We had all the disciplines. And for me, that was, you know, second to not having any censorship for 50 years in my artwork.
Thank you for that. Maybe Victor, you can tell us a little bit also about, you are the author of the manual for the conservation of the murals in Chicano Park. Tell us a little bit about the process for putting that manual together. What kind of informed that process? What are some of the strategies that you've used over time to preserve the murals? And also, what are some of the challenges that you have encountered? I know there's always kind of issues of ownership, right? It's a kind of a, obviously it's a contested land on many fronts. But even just kind of having, you know, City of San Diego or Caltrans, or it's always something, right? So what are some of the challenges that you've
I
encountered?
know just yesterday, people from Sacramento came in, and they just got approved 238 pillars, circular pillars in Sacramento, close to South Park in Sacramento. And their biggest issue was Caltrans. And yesterday we were left where Caltrans did it again. They snuck in the permission for them to continue this project, and they took away the copyright from the artist. And you know, Josie Talamantes was there, and she was very, just really aggressively saying, we cannot let this go by like this. And they were afraid that if they put more obstacles to Caltrans, that they would stop the project. And so yesterday was a pretty heated kind of dialogue. And you know, we have copyright on all the murals that we've restored up to this point. And in just a year and a half ago, Caltrans wanted us to release the copyrights to them according to the fact that they own the pillars. And you know, I was reminded of Michael Schnorr in a lawsuit that he did in the 80s, where Nathan Zackheim, a mural restorer that I researched with from LA, was taking the paint off of walls and then re-gluing them in other walls. So he did that in the section of a mural at the park, and took it to court and showed them that we could release the paint away from the wall and re-glue it in another location. So that proved that we could do that to a mural. And I think he won the case, and we had to remind them at Sacramento. And this is a continuous battle. You know, I know a muralist from the Bay Area to LA, where Caltrans has been doing that, been taking that right of the artists for them to belong to that artwork. And so it's something that distresses me quite a bit, because it's like other people are releasing that right, and then they use that as so we did it in LA, we did it in San Francisco, so now we can do it anywhere we want. And you know, it's really you know, something that is still going on. The book per se has recommendations on materials, the best way to do things. And I think for me, as I'm getting older, that I wanted to make sure that the future generations would know what materials we use and what suggestions to improve or restore those murals. And I'm always doing that during these, you know, many years through Via Internacional. We bring students from different universities, and I always get them to do restorations. And usually in the high school murals that we've done, so that they they get the feeling that they've done something to improve our community, and they're left with this. It's hard to explain how they leave. They take pictures in front of what they've done, and we're using better materials. Now our materials that we're using like the mural that's behind me, has a 50-year durability. And if it's maintained, like giving it a simple wash every 2 years, it would probably be closer to 100 years. So the technology has definitely improved.
That's really insightful. Thank you for that. And thank you for the leadership that you've taken in creating that guide. You're right, it will help future generations be guided in the process for the conservation of the murals, especially because you're talking about materials and process, and that's all really kind of important information to document. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. I want to get into now this article that I read that I shared in the chat that kind of makes an argument for revitalization as opposed to restoration. But before we go on to the next question for that, I want to invite Bianca to please kind of give us a little bit of kind of term identification. We're throwing around a lot of terms that for me, 2 years ago, all meant the same thing. Apparently they all have different definitions. So we're talking about conservation, we're talking about restoration, and we're talking about revitalization. Can you give us a little bit of insight into how those three things are different?
Yeah, that's a kind of important topics to cover, especially in this conversation. I can speak better to the terms of conservation versus restoration. And it's something that it can be geographically dependent. So wherever you are in the world, they might mean the same thing, or you might be talking about the same thing. In the context of this day and age in the United States, they do mean slightly different things. So conservation is the practice of stabilizing, preserving the current state for the future. We respect all original material, we respect artist intent, and we want to make sure that everything that we're doing is retreatable in the future. So none of the materials that we use would ever be confused for the artist's hand, that we are not intervening aesthetically with the hand of the artist in terms of augmenting or making changes. We want to preserve what is currently there that is original by the artist. So for example, if painting's flaking off, I would make sure that I'm introducing adhesive and I'm consolidating, so we are preserving the paint from further damage. I would never scrape off paint. That would be a huge no-no. If I don't like the shade of the blue in the sky, I would never repaint it. That's also a huge no-no for me as a conservator. When it comes to restoration, in terms of within conservation, it kind of implies a greater degree of aesthetic intervention. So if I have a loss in, say, like a Greek vase, for example, like one of these archaeological ceramic vases, you could find all the different shards of this pottery and you could reconstruct it and leave it as is. When you start saying like filling the missing areas, so you're starting to introduce this aesthetic sort of component to it, and you can take it to different degrees of. So you could leave it so it's very easily distinguishable from the original material, whether it's the color sometimes is usually our biggest visual cue. But I can also go a little step further and try to make it look like it wasn't broken. So I could, in the areas that I filled, and we never go over any of the original, in the areas that I filled, I could then start toning. So I can make it look like it blends in. I can go even further and I can follow if it's a repeating pattern or if I have a reference image of what it used to look like, I could recreate what's missing. So within conservation, that would be considered more on the restoration side, but conservation is the general practice of what we do. When it comes to revitalization, I feel like that is not, that can imply other things that are maybe beyond our professional scope, depending on how you view it, right? I think it implies an act of continuous, I think it's like more contextualized also, again, going back to this idea of community and like who is a caretaker for it. I don't think you can necessarily revitalize something out of context. So I feel a little more comfortable talking about revitalization, but I am really looking forward to talk about it further later on in this conversation, if that's okay.
Yeah, thank you for that. And actually, I wanted to invite Victor to tell us a little bit about what revitalization means, especially as it has been kind of put in action in Chicano Park and with the Chicano Park murals. And this article that I read, that I shared with everyone, talks about the idea that it is a very intentional move to revitalize versus to restore, because the idea that I read it as the Chicano Park murals are living testimonios of the story of the community. So if the original murals were painted in the 70s and we assume that that moment is static and that the movement is static, counterintuitively to itself, then it kind of begins and ends in that one place. But if we think of time as cyclical and we think of our communities as very much, you know, continuing in the struggle, then it is very easy to understand how the concept of revitalization makes perfect sense for a community like the Chicano community, which continues to be very much alive and living in this moment, right? In this struggle, in this 50-year moment. I wanted to read an excerpt from that article that actually quotes Victor Ochoa. It says, Ochoa sees the overall repainting project as an important reminder that the issues of bilingual education, immigration, and barrio violence continue to challenge Latinos. The revived mural renews commitment to facing those issues, and the art memorializes the historical links between the activism of the 1970s and the marches and rallies organized in Chicano Park today. I always felt that art was a weapon for change and an instrument of revolutionary consciousness. I think that's such a beautiful way to contextualize what feels like a polarizing argument, right? Revitalization versus conservation. But it doesn't have to be when we look at it from this intersectional moment, where even a continuing kind of a moment of resistance is also part of conserving, because you step away from conserving the object and you think about conserving the narrative and conserving the collective action of art making. So with that, I'll move on to my next question. And this is for Victor. Tell us, what is at play when a mural is revitalized? What is the cultural significance of revitalizing a mural versus conserving it in the state it was first created in? What documentation efforts occur, and at what phases of the murals? And why do those matter?
You know, like the first ramps that we restored, they used lead paint. Some people used lead paint without really authorization of the group they had bought the material. So a lot of it was scraped off, you know, big chunks. I have pictures of the people that came in to remove the lead paint. And so we did, you know, take tracings, we took photographs, we even did color palettes, because, you know, they were pretty burned out in that. I know for those particular ramps, that was really, really complex. I know that as a Chicano, when I want to explain what it is to be a Chicano, I think I have to always say that it is an attitude that makes us a Chicano. It's not where you were born. If you have one foot in Tijuana and another foot in San Isidro, you know, it doesn't. That really doesn't. That's not the definition of who we are. I always thought of the issues, and so I make this list of issues that we've had for the past 50 years, and fortunately, they're the same issues. This mural behind me is about immigration, and it's still as complex, and it's still, I think in a lot of ways since the Trump era, it's gotten worse. You know, I think police brutality, this supremacist attitudes are worse now. So in a way, to restore or revitalize something that was done 50 years ago, it's pretty much the same. We don't really have to like contemporize the way we're presenting it back to the community. We're just, kind of like repeating what was done then. And I know bilingual education, it seems like it's gotten worse. I mean, it all of our topics, I think maybe even the farm workers, I know the farm workers issue was really bad. My daughter and I went on a train trip up north, and I never seen so many homeless farm workers in the trees just going down the valley in the train. So I think for us, in one of my greatest joys on this whole thing of revitalization, restoration, was that the younger generation, in which has affected a lot of the development of Barrio Logan now, saw the murals when they were bleached out and falling apart, and that affected them psychologically. I think, oh, that's old school. That was then, and now the colors are bright and they can relate to that sense. It's like now it's cool to hear all your information with your ear pods or 15-second video clips instead of what I always thought maybe a half an hour video clip. That's not fashionable anymore. They feel that they belong more to this revitalized version of the mural, and the pigments are super different than what we used 50 years ago. So this mural behind me is all in pearlescent, and the pearlescent prisms in the medium do not oxidize. So they're plastic, and they stay metallic and brilliant and radiant for 50 years. So people that come, children that come and see it, you could tell that it's it hits them, with more intensity. So I love that. I love that another generation is there to enjoy it and to feel part of it. To me, that's really important, that they're really enjoying the new version of the same mural.
Leticia, can I add something?
Of course.
I love just kind of listening and learning more and becoming more sort of attuned to how to connect this on many levels. Of course, grounding it in the presentation of and preservation of the at the Chicano Park and at the Centro and of our other sacred spaces. But I often, I'm a runner, and I think about long runs, and I need to, the day after, I need to stop and restore, and restoration is about a pause, at least the way that I'm sort of aligning it or making this connection. It's about a pause and a rest and reflecting, like my knees begin to hurt, or, I don't know, an ankle is bothering me or whatnot. And so I'm reflecting on what I need to do to improve my form or my breathing or whatnot. And so like just kind of extending that analogy of restoring as rest and reflection, I think can teach us a lot, as a community of artists, of cultural bearers, of educators, of muralistas, danzantes, maestros, maestras, children. You know, what is it that we need in that retrospect, in that moment of restoration to move forward and to revitalize? And so I think what Victor outlines is precisely that, you know, that gap moment of the bleached walls, the whiteout walls of like, whoa, like what do we need to care for our community, to care for our, to love ourselves, and to remind each other of our humanity, and to remind of ourselves of our humanity. And so that is then we have more energy, and we have new energy, and we're able to revitalize. So that just kind of came to mind, and I felt like that was an interesting sort of analogy, you know, to make, that a pause and reflection isn't necessarily like a bad thing, although it can teach us. It can feel stifling maybe in the moment. It can also feel silencing. Maybe it feels, oh, you know, we're not in the causa, we're not in the struggle, something's wrong, you know, our demands aren't being met, whatnot. We're not producing. But I think that we need that time.
I love that.
I used to be a runner too, and I as my knees are hurting, no more cartilage, shoulders, all messed up. I can feel that. But I'm working on the 5-story mural right now, and I'm getting stronger because I'm using the arm rails to walk up the stairs. And my knees, man. But my legs are getting stronger.
Nomás no me eches la sal, Victor, eh?
Oh, why would I do that?
No, qué bueno. Strength.
Salt
Building strength.
can be healing, though, by the way.
Exactly.
I have a curandera that uses salt to heal animals and other people. It takes out the poisons and stuff like that.
So resting, restoring to build strength too, right? So
I'm an expert at siesta breaks.
I have to say that I am really loving this space right now, and to have the opportunity to contextualize conservation work from a Chicanx lens is really a beautiful thing for me. I've been in at BACC for about 1.5 years now, and obviously everything that I come across, so much knowledge and so many resources and so much that is happening, I can't help but contextualize it from my cultural lens, and to be able to be in conversation and hear you all talk about how these moments, these pauses can help also, you know, bring in new generations of community to be part of historical moments, but also kind of really give us a moment to rest and to think when we think about conservation from the point of view of the field. It's also about pausing the deterioration. Right, so we preserve for longer times by putting kind of things in place to pause the deterioration, but also acknowledging that it continues to live, and that it continues to morph and change and kind of live out its life, and it's not meant to be eternal. So that whole process is really kind of beautiful to think of from this space. Maria, you addressed some of the things that I had in my next question, but I wanted to kind of go back and consider revitalization as speaking to murals as living testimonios of a moment that is still alive, and a struggle for this community that very much continues. What are your thoughts on revitalizing murals versus conserving them, or restoring them, or preserving them, the verses doesn't have to be so aggressive as they were initially painted?
thank you. You know, I really appreciate Bianca's explanation from the expert, you know, and practitioner of a conservator, and they're not mutually exclusive, you know, and I don't think that they're divorced from any one and also perhaps not even linear. You know, I think that there is sort of this, this recursive nature to, you know, revitalize, restoration, conservation, revitalization, and not in that particular order. If we're open to kind of exploring the layers of what they each entail. And so I often think like of conservation, like who are we conserving these things for? And being an instructor of writing, I'm always thinking audience, and being a writer myself, I'm thinking, who am I writing for? Who is reading this? So this is sort of my writer mind as well. And oftentimes conservation can feel that it's also passive, you know, although I think a reframing, and I love the way Leticia talks about the art, the murals as public testimonials of our community. You said that so well, that to conserve is also to acknowledge that there is like a legacy, you know, that something came before us, that we are not the beginning, we are part of that narrative. We are part of that thread of testimonials. And so as Chicanas, Chicanos, as indigenous peoples who believe in the practice, I think, of honoring our elders in very kind of tangible, authentic ways, then we need to manifest that in concrete ways and conserve, like conservar, ¿verdad? Conservar tradiciones, conservar conocimientos, conservar. And why do I go into my Spanish brain? Because like it feels like that's the way that I conserve ideas and imagery and story and whatnot. And so that is sort of an anchoring, but it's not the end all. And so if we revitalize, I think about revitalize as like floricanto, you know, as it's like this multiplicity of ideas and how it comes through, and even the way that it's practiced. So I appreciate like the move to revitalize from a conservation lens or framing, because again, I think the way that I was talking about restoration and breathing new life into a project, into a mural, you know, my baby girl who's 12 now, she, I think, was like a year when the second iteration when the iteration of the revitalizations of the murals were happening. And so to see that, that journey, you know, and to align her growth, as part of the growth of this, you know, in the journey of these murals, that to me, the growth and the energy and the floricanto of our community is the testimonial of that revitalization. And I know that from just lived experience, what I witnessed in that process was, as Victor described, like people who maybe back, you know, in the original times that the Chicano Park was being kind of created and founded, weren't necessarily part of this, you know, founding or original, you know, images up on the pillars. And so they are now part of this new energy. Young people, it's intergenerational, connecting with the pillars being like these urban trees, these urban elders that are standing tall, you know, in our community, sort of overlooking us and protecting. And what that can happen, what that can do with when a young person, you know, comes to that mural to touch it or to see it or to just be up close and personal, because we know that in museums, they put those, you know, barriers there for us, and they have people guarding and saying, don't get too close. You know, you can't fully synergistically vibe. And there's something to say that there's an important, I think, spiritual component in the process of a revitalization. So, you know, that to say that the techniques and the skills evolve, you know, and then we continue to evolve from there. So again, from what I witnessed in this revitalization, Victor, you please confirm the dates, but I do dates now from like my children's ages, but I want to say it was probably like 8 or 9 years ago. Maybe, why does it feel maybe more than that? It could be my COVID, context too, where everything feels like so long ago. But just to witness that, to witness people going up and up on the scaffolds, myself included, my children included, to be up close and personal.
Already 12 years old, 12 years old.
That was 12, yeah. Porque mi esperanza is 12. And that's when that was the moment,
Little Omic that I saw her on Facebook.
And my mijito Cuauhtemoc is up on that pillar behind, behind Victor,
Yeah, he's right where my finger is, right around here.
Right there. So it's all of that, and it's I appreciate like the articles that you have mentioned and brought into the chat here, and a case to revitalize, to reignite vida, ¿verdad? And like I said, vida, arte is vida. It's a connection to the creator. It's a connection to, our spirituality and the energy that is individually within us, around us, and what we all bring collectively.
I'd like to quickly mention something that this reminds me of so much, that there was a so-called Hispanic bank downtown, and they wanted a mural. I went over there and he looked at me and says, "Oh, you Chicanos, you are so primerist. You paint raw, basic colors, and I'm going, well, I just did this one in sepia tone, the Mexican Revolution, and only used brown." And but right around that time, they were restoring the Sistine Chapel and a Rembrandt, I think, here in Balboa Park. In the Sistine Chapel had like 500 years of soot, candles, and incense. So this guy thought that this Rembrandt, it's all brown and dark, and you can barely see the faces. And also the Sistine Chapel was like soot, just all dark. When they started cleaning them, I remember they used to use these little Q-tips, square inch by square inch. They find out that the Sistine Chapel is as bright as what I have behind me. It's like primary. And people for so many years were thinking that, oh, Europeans paint in this more developed way in browns and sepia tones and stuff. When they cleaned it up and they cleaned up this Rembrandt, these are pink cheeks and all this kind of stuff. It was funny. They protested against the restoration and revitalization of
that. Thank you for that. I love that story, Victor. Now I'm going to move on to Bianca now. We're getting close to the end. And I want to hear your thoughts, Bianca. I know revitalization isn't a traditional approach to preservation, but if anything has happened here, space has been held for the importance of revitalization as a community-led approach to preservation and a very powerful opportunity that it lends. What efforts can a community take to preserve the history of that narrative and that process and the multi-layers? Victor mentioned earlier how he kind of creates layers in between the new layers. And I know that is also something we actually just talking about that yesterday, that conservators, as part of the ethics of it always being reversible is something that conservators do when they approach their work and their treatment as well. What are some of the efforts that a community can take to preserve this layered history, and why is that important?
Such a good
I
question.
know that when we started using the acrylic B72, it was told that you apply that on the original work and it will boost up the 80 to 100% of the original pigment, and kind of like reconnect it back to the surface. And we loved it. We started using it, and in fact, I just found out that we can't get it right now because of this the shipping issues with chemicals and stuff like that. But that was one of the things that really, to me, really helped me to see what the future could be, and that we could still work chips and things like that that were messed up on the mural. But the acrylic B72 really impressed me a lot in the process of restoring.
Yeah, and that's actually a material that we commonly use in conservation as well, for all the reasons that you just explained. It's a varnish, it's an adhesive, it serves as a barrier and isolating layer, which is how you use it, and what Leticia was referring to, the conversation that we were having. It's this idea of layers of protection. I kind of want to go back to the idea of like conservation, revitalization, restoration. And I said like I wasn't super comfortable talking about revitalization within that context of like defining it within conservation, but it's more because you can't, revitalization, like it means so many different things to different people. And for example, when I work on a painting and I finish a treatment, I have a connection with it forever. Like I can probably remember almost every painting that I've ever treated throughout my career. There's a very personal connection between you and the art because you are staring at it for so long and you are caring for it. It's almost like each treatment is a child that you birth. So for me, it definitely feels like I am revitalizing something, but what it means to me, it's so different to what it means to the owner. And what it means to the owner's family, what it means to their past, their present, their future. So it just holds these different meanings, layers of meanings, and the values that it holds is also, it's really intangible. Whether, so for some people, they approach art from a monetary value. It also has a sentimental value, but it can have such great cultural value. So you can't divorce, I think, you can't approach it in a clinical way, the same way that I would approach conservation and restoration and revitalization. Also, I'm really struck by the comment about removing the murals from the sites. Yes, technically speaking, that is possible. We have the technology, we have the knowledge to do it, but site and the environment, it has so much context also to it, like the significance that it has to the meaning of these murals. Specific, like think of Chicano Park and what the struggle has been to have these murals in that site. So if you were to remove those murals and you put them in a museum, is it the same meaning and context? Is it this analogy that Maria brought of the murals, the pillars being these urban trees and elders, site has meaning. So divorcing the murals from the site, you lose some of that meaning. So that's, even though you might revitalize the space, there's something that is lost there, or like some context to the art. And it happens often in museums as well. Like that's why we can't always necessarily connect. And it's this divide. Sometimes it's very physical, the space, right? You have physical barriers, but it's because you don't have the same cultural context. So you must read a book or you must read the text on the wall to understand that. So it's never going to necessarily always be the same. But we also, conservators have this sort of reputation for keeping everything in the stasis or reverting things back to its original state. And that's not always true, especially when we're talking about the built environment, what we've created around us. And we acknowledge that it's ever changing and we need to make room for us and our own current cultural values. I'm also really struck by the idea of asking the community for permission in this revitalization process. Because I'm thinking now of, as a community, our own cultural values are always ever changing. We share a commonality, but modern times, like, things change. Like these, what is it, 30-second clips versus a 30-minute tour of a mural. And that's what future generations are not gonna take away from these murals. So I think I'm just really curious what happens to if revitalization allows space for this within a community context. I'm curious to what happens as maybe values change and evolve, and with the community and the caretakers changing, because one generation, there is some knowledge that is passed on from generation to generation, but it will keep changing. So the permission and respect, will these images then also be ever changing and evolving with the community? And I think that's great. I think that is fantastic. In terms of what efforts can a community take to preserve the history of the narrative, I think going back to archives and documenting, that's a fantastic way of having this record, this trajectory, this history of the site, of the artist. We could, if we had images of the first mural that Victor did and what his technique was at that point in time and what you're doing nowadays, and if you could document the same mural throughout all the different times that you have revitalized that would have, it would just be this invaluable record, not just for you, but for me, for the community at large, because it also keeps a history of these tableros expresiones, or it captures this visual history of space and community. So I would say that you've done so much amazing work by writing this book, and we can keep augmenting it, right? Adding to this knowledge and narrative into the future. And it can always be an ever-changing approach to it, right? We know that our values are not fixed, and our approach to caring can also change over time. And that's okay as long as it's done within the context and permission of the community that's being cared within. So photo documentation, writing it down, keeping track of materials, taking images, doing videos, doing tours, these are all great ways of preserving the history of that narrative in ways that can exist beyond the walls or the pillars of the space.
Great. I really like when I get kids to fix something that's messed up, and then I get them to fix them. It's like my little grandson. He has a little toolbox with a little drill. The TV wasn't working, so he wanted to get back there and fix it. And what's left afterwards? I mean, now after 52 years, I've seen several generations of people. They go, oh, I remember when I was in the 3rd grade, and now they're adults, and they got grandkids themselves, and that process of having the community be part of the restoration, part of the revitalization, I think it's really important to keep that spirit going. It gives them the kind of like the feeling of more closeness to the work. I don't have the words, but usually I do things from a spiritual part, and then later on they write the curriculum. What I just did to it, I didn't even realize that I was doing group projects, and they tell me, oh, you've been doing this for 20 years, and so, oh, is that what I've been doing? It's kind of interesting.
Victor, I have I have a question that has been kind of nagging at me, like after reading the article, and it's going back to only the artist can, you should bring back the artist, but obviously the artist is always going to revitalize because their technique has progressed. One, I think the sharing of knowledge is really important for this continuous, like, generational preservation of culture, right? So whether it's revitalizing, restoring, conserving the murals, or other cultural aspects. But what happens when you no longer have access to the original artist? Is there a given permission or consent for someone else? What happens when the artist is no longer with us? Can someone else step in from the community, or whoever has been blessed or given permission to do the revitalization? Or do we at that point stop, and do we preserve then the image as it was because the artist can no longer revitalize it? Does it belong to the community?
You know, it's an interesting question because, you know, some of the original artists have passed away. Vidal Aguirre and the Kiosco. Felipe Adames passed away. There's been a lot of artists that have passed away, and we did think about that and try to get people that worked similarly than that artist. You know, there was this kind of a little bit of a process. Just recently, Magoo, there was a painting in Pasadena that was painted about Magoo in his style, in his caricatures and his dogs and that, by the East Los Streetscapers. The East Los Streetscapers were sort of parallel with Magoo, but the mural, if you see the mural, it looks like Magoo painted it, but so we're kind of tricky. We're kind of, I was gonna say magicians in a lot of ways. You see somebody does cartoons, in their murals, and so we get somebody to do something similar, like Lalo Alcaraz. We have another kid that does cartoons. He's been doing Lalo Alcaraz's Cucaracha for years now. And I didn't realize that this kid was doing his cartoons, and they meet and they talk about the concept, and then this other guy escapes his name, but things like that are possible. I think, no doubt, after 52 years, many of us are going to go to that other level, and that's one of the reasons I worked on that book, is that we have good pictures. The museum right now, one of the first things that we're doing is preserving or making an archive of all video and images, and we're starting just to, even though we're not open, we already bought I forget what it's called, a Google something drive to start putting in countless materials to document that past. So I think we're in the spirit of the original artists. We can call it a lot of different ways, but this one, if you see the one that I'm talking about, Magoo, you're going to be surprised. You would think that he painted it.
Thank you for that. Thank you also, Bianca, for your kind of really insightful way of wrapping up a lot of these concepts. We've had a really fruitful and inviting and accessible conversation that really kind of summoned and tapped into so many different areas of thought, so many different areas of knowledge and spirituality and presence and community. And that's really beautiful to be able to intersect all of those roads and be able to speak from here, and hopefully incite further curiosity and further questions. I wanted to wrap up by asking a final thought question. I feel like we we learned a lot. Bianca shared a lot about her own kind of technical process when she approaches treatment work. We learned a lot about the site of Chicano Park and the murals and the history and the preservation and revitalization, about Safos as really an idea of protection and safety. And I think sometimes when we think about conservation in the way that institutions practice it, it comes in a really neat box, and there isn't space for a lot of things. You know, the field of conservation is very much informed by Eurocentric notions of art and excellence. And when other things don't fit in there, it feels like they don't exist anywhere else. And if it doesn't apply in this particular way, then you haven't explored it. But to me, the idea of Safos and the fact that we have imbued, and I say we as a Chicana, putting myself in the space as a Chicana, but also interestingly in the space of the field of conservation as one of very few Chicanas in the field of conservation, not as a conservator myself, but as an administrator. Thinking that this has always been present, right? In our communities, we all practice preservation. We exist as Chicanos and Chicanas and Chicanx as a moment of resistance. Our entire identity is built on this idea of resistance and affirmation and protest. So preservation and conservation and revitalization and restoration is part of our everyday life and part of our culture. So I really appreciate us being able to talk about it today and kind of summon all of these feelings. As a final thought, I wanted to inquire with Maria and Victor, what are some of the ways that the field of conservation, BACC and organizations like it can help support preservation efforts for the Chicanx community?
Well, you know, as you know, I've been using your center for years. In fact, I always had a restoration component in my curriculum on the college level. And so we really enjoyed doing tours to the site and seeing the process that you have there. And to me, that's been an important thing in the way the students see this, you know, that they see how other artwork, and then I always get them to go to the park and do some restoration or revitalization at the park. And so it means something like you're more official, like you're, you know, oh, we're going to the museums. And so it kind of means something more. And I like to invite people to think of it as a career or something that they could maybe do in the future. So I try to instigate those things when I do that. But I think I really felt great when you brought some of the staff over to the park, and I think we do need to have more similar dialogues and collaborations. And you know, it's really important to, you know, I think that people need to learn where we're at in our culture and our, you know, because when we first started painting murals, we were sort of like graffiti artists, because you know, I think the first ramps were like billboards, and I know a lot of the white supremacists would say that we were just propaganda. Oh, you're just propaganda. I remember trying to paint a skeleton, and Mexicans came off the freeway and says, "Oh, don't paint, don't do this, don't do Che Guevara." You know, I think collaborating with you in different documenting and maybe putting it into words so that more people can understand what conservation, restoration. I like to teach Caltrans to realize that we need to wash the murals every couple of years. I used to invite the fire department to come in with their ladder trucks and hose the carbon monoxide and the salts and bacteria that coat the surface of the murals. And you know, there needs to be a little bit more responsibility now that we're national landmark, things like that. Maybe even help us put lighting in there. And I know I want to do a QR code on every mural where everybody can just wave their phone and get all the information they want. Our third edition of our book on Chicano Park is being prepared right now by Alberto Pulido and students. And so we're really, it's been sold out every time. And it'd be nice to have a piece from you in the book, say what how you see the restoration of the murals in that official capacity. I know a lot of academia will listen to you more than a street thug like me learning from the calles.
Leticia, oh, you can hear me? Can you? Yes, I mean, I think, Leticia, what you're doing is historic. I mean, I don't know if that intentional sort of collaboration and centering of Chicana and Chicanx indigenous voices has occurred in the way that you are framing, the dialogues, the pláticas, and the curiosity to further the research. And I would say that that it needs to continue by hiring people like you in leadership positions, like Bianca, who come with the very specific intersectional, if you want to use the jargon of culturally responsive, culturally sustaining kind of lenses. We can, I like to use like the trucha pedagogy, like the trucha lens, like we have that. And so I think when we come with that conocimiento into these spaces that historically have been Eurocentric, very white male, focused and led, and framing, it creates, again, an alter narrative. And so, looking to the people who have been doing this work at Chicano Park, at the Centro, at the front, and, Chicano Park Museum, we've been doing it out of necessity to preserve our story, to preserve to say we're here and don't forget us, and we're here for our people, and we will continue to be here because we always have been. And so we've had to learn these ways a la fuerza with very limited resources and kind of create our own methodologies, if you will, that are just as legitimate, because look what we've been able to produce, look what we've been able to create and persevere, even in the margins, so to speak. So we have been able to center, ourselves in very self-determined and empowering ways. So we need to bring in that knowledge, and we need to bring in that to these spaces, such as where you are, but not in a way that's tokenizing either. I think that we also need to be very careful, and I'm not suggesting that this is happening, but this is the movement now in all institutions, right? Institutions of higher education, institutions of, cultural art centers, everywhere. The cultural and political landscape, I think, tells us that we need to be inclusive. I would say let's be radically inclusive, and let's really sort of push a narrative that is not simply, at a surface level, and avoid the tokenizing of our communities and of ourselves. And again, I'm not suggesting that that's what's happening here, but I would hope that this is, as we continue to see ourselves in these positions, that we continue to maintain that spirit, of self-determination, and preservation in order to persevere and to continue, building and documenting our stories and our existence. Yeah.
Thank you for that. That was beautiful. Thank you both for sharing your thoughts. I think there's definitely a ton of leadership that organizations like the ACC can take from communities, especially as they enter this space. We are intentionally and radically wanting to shift the way that these institutions have worked in the past. And one thing that we take very seriously at BACC is the idea that inclusion and diversity is not a deliverable, it's a process. So even within the work of having these conversations that can be painful sometimes for all parties involved to kind of go through that, through that trauma to undo the trauma, right? So it's always a space of healing, and it's always an opportunity to learn and to grow and to be better and to stand behind our claims, right? That we want to be inclusive in a radical way, as you mentioned. It is no longer enough just to be inclusive. We have to be radically inclusive. Totally agree with that. I want to thank you, all three of you, for participating in today's panel. This was such a beautiful kickoff of our series of conversations. I want to remind everyone that we have 3 more coming up. Next Thursday, we have Rasquachismo, Beyond Aesthetics, the Sensibilities of Documentation in Chicana, Chicano, Chicanx art. And we'll talk about, different kind of using mixed media and the importance of not just mixed media, the importance of documenting materials and process and artist intent. And when you're producing as an artist, to think of 500 years down the line, what would you want the Bianca of the future to keep in mind when she's treating your work? The Thursday after that, we'll have Inside Outside, Preservation of Chicana, Chicano, Chicana's culture within and without institutions. So really kind of looking at some major institutions and their approach to conservation and curatorial work, and kind of talking about a lot of these, defining these terms. How does Chicano art end up in museums? What is that process? What happens when an artwork is going to be on exhibit? What does conservation necessarily entail? And so all of those things, we'll be talking to Jill Dossie, who just curated Yolanda Lopez's Que en Paz Descanse's exhibit at MCASD, and also in conversation with Maria Esther Fernandez, the inaugural artistic director at the Cheech, and Roberto Hernandez from the Centro, all 3 institutions that have the mandate of really kind of holding Chicano culture and can take an opportunity to use this moment to teach us a little bit about their process. So we're excited for that. And then finally, the last Thursday will be the different one. It'll be in the morning instead of these afternoon, evening ones. It will be Adonde Vamos Chicana, Chicano, Chicanx, setting intentions for cultural preservation. And for that one, we are going to be going live from Denver from the Latinos in Heritage Conservation conference in Denver, where we will be talking, just kind of wrapping up all of these thoughts and conversations and thinking about what does the workforce of the field of conservation look like, and what efforts are we making to demystify conservation so that folks in our region geographically and in different cultures have access to it as a field. And what are some of the ways that we can learn about the amazing work that has already happened in tribal communities, setting their own guidelines and intentions for how they want their cultural material to be approached by the field of conservation and institutions. So lots of more great additional amazing conversations to be had, and I hope that they are all as amazing as this one, because this was really beautiful. Thank you again, Bianca and Maria and Victor, for joining us today. Thank you again also to the folks at the Centro for tuning in a collective spirit. And of course, to the City of San Diego Commission for Arts and Culture and California Humanities for supporting this really, really important work. This has to happen now, it has to happen again, and it has to keep happening more and more often so that we can document and learn and grow and start accessing resources so that we can continue saving our culture and our heritage for the next generations. So with that really long sentence, thank you all.
Gracias.
Thank you all.
Adiós.